today's video, we're going to be doing the overhead on the Detroit Diesel Series 60 in my Prevost. Detroit Diesel Series 60s are known for being million-mile engines, and they've earned this reputation with really good reliability. There's not a whole lot that you need to do to keep them going for that long period of time besides oil changes, but you do need to do a few things, and one of those things that you need to do is what's called an overhead. Now, what exactly is an overhead? If you've worked on cars, you've probably heard about doing a valve adjustment, and an overhead is kind of the same idea. In most automotive applications where you need to adjust valves, you've got a set screw and then you've got an adjusting screw within it, and between those two you're able to get the correct valve lash, or the distance between the tappet or the rocker and the valve head itself, to be the accurate specification. When you get to these big diesel engines that are used in semi-trucks, you've got a few more things sometimes that you have to deal with. On any engine that has jake brakes, you have to do a similar kind of adjustment for the jakes. And then on an engine like this, where you've got a mechanical over electronic unit injector, sometimes called a MUI, those also have an adjustment with them. So the reason why it's called an overhead is because you're doing all of these overhead clearances, and it's not just a valve check. I've been kind of dreading this job, and it's not because I don't like doing valve adjustments. I actually rather enjoy them. But on this one, there's a few more complications, and they really all come down to access. The first aspect is the valve cover is clearly, as you can see, oh no, you can't see, it's under these two tubes. Removing the tubes themselves is going to be pretty simple, at least I hope so. This large one is going from the air cleaner to the turbocharger, and then the smaller one is going from the intercooler or charge air cooler to the engine. So I have to get those off. However, from that point, I then have to be able to reach back in to get the valve cover off, and there's a bit of a clearance issue. Prevost has an access panel from the factory, but that access panel in my installation is covered up by the bedroom closet area. So unfortunately, there's not an easy way for me to get that out without really disassembling the closet. I really don't want to do that. So I have limited space to work with, both with getting at the valve cover. I'm going to have to reach pretty far back in to get at some of the bolts to get the valve cover off, and then I'm not going to be able to easily get at everything from up top to try to get in and adjust the valves. But hopefully we can make this work. One thing that's going to be working in my favor with this is that my engine does not have jake brakes on it. This is important because the jake brakes sit higher up than the rest of the valve. If I had jake brakes, I'm not sure that I could do this without somehow moving the engine back, but without them I think it will be doable. One thing that's important to note is that I will not be covering jake brake adjustments in this video since I don't have jakes on my engine. I will be covering the valve adjustments, both intake and exhaust, and then also the injector adjustment. Those are going to be the same with or without jake brakes, so if you have a Series 60, those parts of the video will still apply to you, and adjusting jake brakes is a similar general concept. There's not too much that you're going to need for special tools to do this job. You're going to need a set of feeler gauges so that you can get the clearances right for the valves. You're also going to need a dial indicator and then have some kind of solid base for it to mount on. You don't need this so much for the accuracy of its reading, but it's more than anything so that you can see when the injector cam lobe that pushes the injector, and you'll see how this works in a bit, is at its highest position because that's where you need it to be to set the injector. I got this one from Harbor Freight a while ago. There's other options out there, but you don't need to get one that's super expensive. Anything will do. So with that, let's start by getting these tubes off and see what kind of access we have once they're out. Well, I got those two air tubes off. That was easy as expected. So now you can get a better idea of what we're working with and see a little bit more of what I was talking about as far as access goes. So there are 8 bolts that hold the valve cover on, and if you look carefully here, you can see that this is really a 2-stage valve cover. You've got this tall valve cover up here that goes onto this spacer plate that's a couple inches, and the spacer plate is what actually bolts to the head. So my hope is that this tall valve cover is going to be able to just slide right off, that the rockers and injector and all of that will be underneath and I don't need to lift it up much, and that then I have enough access. Certainly the forward 3 or 4 cylinders shouldn't be a problem, but those rear 2 might be a little bit of an issue because those are behind this access panel here. And you probably can't see from this angle, but there are several bolts in the side, and you can see where the access panel should be removable, but isn't in this installation due to how the bedroom closet was set up. You can see that I also have to take off this attachment for the breather that goes to the slobber tube, and as you can see it's been slobbering a bit, so I should probably take a look at replacing that and cleaning this up a little. One other thing that I'll point out, you can see over on this port here, which is the air intake port for the engine, but I did it on all of the other ports that are exposed. I just took a shop rag and put the hose clamp that I took off around it to hold it in place. I didn't tighten it down or anything, but the purpose of that is to prevent any debris from getting into those areas that could then get into the engine. Anytime you've got your air inlets or air ports of any sort exposed, you want to make sure that you've got some kind of a cover like that to prevent debris from getting in. So let's detach the slobber tube here, then we'll go through and we'll get these bolts off. Okay, I've gotten the 8 bolts out that hold the valve cover to the valve cover spacer, and then I've also gotten the 2 clamps off for the slobber tube. This is in place fairly hard, so I think I'm going to have to try to pry it off while pushing the valve cover over towards the passenger side. And then we'll see what I'm able to get out here. On kind of tight, especially for being something that seems well lubricated. The valve cover itself came off pretty easily though. And then one of the hard parts with this is you do want to try to minimize the amount of junk that goes into the valve area, but sometimes you just got to do the best you can. Clean it up later. All right, got that off. Okay, now let's see how I can wiggle this valve cover off, or if I can. That was not as bad as I thought it might be. Well, that actually came off reasonably well, and kind of what I had suspected and hoped was the case. If you look here, you can see that it looks like you just barely have the tops of these exhaust rockers protruding just a little bit above this flat surface here. So because of that, I was able to get the valve cover off. And I'm not going to need to take this middle spacer off, although I could if I wanted to. This is going to be plenty of room for me to work with to get the valve adjustment done. So here you can see what I was talking about and how all this works. Remember that the Series 60 is a 4 valve per cylinder engine. So these are the exhaust valves. On this side you've got the exhaust manifold that goes to the turbo. These two here are for the intake valves, so the intake is on that side. And then in the center here you have this additional rocker, and what that feeds is this mechanical over electronic unit injector. So diesels need an incredibly high amount of fuel pressure to get the fuel pushed into the cylinder under a high compression ratio up at top dead center. And with this, the way that this works is that you've got a rocker driven by the camshaft, which then pushes down on the injector, and that's what provides the force that's needed to get that very high pressure. From there, you've got these wires that come from the electrical drivers, and that will produce the exact timing and exact quantity of fuel that's required. If you've ever seen the injector that you've got on an old 2-stroke or mechanical, just using a 2-stroke Detroit as an example, you've got something that looks very similar, but then instead of these wires, you've got a rack that moves some rods in and out of the injectors, and those rods are then what are determining the quantity of fuel, and then the plunger is determining, or the rocker is then determining the timing of the fuel and providing the force. This is definitely a better system, and these injectors are known for being a very reliable way of injecting fuel in a diesel. Whenever you've got the valve cover off, you also just want to take a look at the cam. You can see that on a Series 60 you've got an overhead cam setup, so you just want to take a look, make sure that you don't see any valves that are showing any issues or signs of distress. And if you look carefully, you'll see a little bit of debris got into the engine. Nothing that's particularly concerning. It's just kind of how these things go. but I will try to get them get the little debris blown off before I put things back together. So before you get started doing the overhead, probably one of the things you should do first is just a general inspection to make sure that you don't have to pull anything more significant. For the most part, you can just do a basic visual inspection and make sure that everything is looking good and doesn't look like you have any major problems. Things like a broken spring are really easy to identify, but there are a couple of areas to note. Some Series 60s had these little cups that go on the valve adjuster touching the valve that were known for having problems. This is apparently the later style that's not one to be concerned with. You want to take a look down and take a look at the camshaft lobes, see if you see any pitting or issues there. And then you also want to take a look at these rollers that are on the rockers. And if you take a look here closely, you can see that this one has kind of a area in the middle that's got a little bit more of a wear mark, and that part's okay. But then there's also some pitting in here that I can just barely feel with my fingernail. And I've found, I guess it's 3 or 4 of the exhaust rollers that are like that, that have that little bit of pitting on them. I guess 5 here, because I can see just the tiniest bit on that number 1 exhaust roller. I haven't seen any of this on the intake roller or the injector rollers. Those all seem just fine. So now I need to figure out whether those exhaust rollers are something that I'm going to need to replace, or if what's on there is going to be okay and serviceable. So I think that probably has me done for today while I figure that out. If I do have to pull them, then that's not all that bad to get them out, but first I want to figure out what's going on. So I guess I'm going to figure out whether I'm going to adjust these as is, or if I'm going to pull the rockers and then get those replaced. It's a few weeks later. I did a good amount of digging both online in the forums as well as through the Detroit Diesel manual, and after taking a look at it, I decided that the best thing to do was going to be to replace all of the exhaust rockers with the associated rollers. The reason I decided to go this route is that over half of the rollers had some kind of pitting on them, and although a lot of people on the forums suggested that I would probably be okay to continue running the engine as is for a while, I figured I might as well do it now while I've got the valve cover off. To me, it made sense to do all 6 because although I could have saved some money and not done 1 or 2, since most of them were showing issues, I figured that the others were probably not far behind in terms of showing issues as well, and I'd rather just do this once than not have to touch it again for a long time. All of that's going to be in a separate video, so the next time you see this, we're going to be doing the valve adjustment with my new rockers in place. Alright, I'm getting here to do the overhead and show you what you need to do on this. The first thing that I should point out is that this is a DDEC 4 engine, and from the manual, DDEC 1, 2, 3, or 4 is going to be basically the same, but a DDEC 5 and 6 is going to have a newer style injector, and the procedure for it is slightly different. So the thing that they tell you to do in the manual for the 1 through 4 like this one is that you find a cylinder that has valve overlap, and in this case this is cylinder 1. There's no lash on the intake, there's no lash on the exhaust, and I haven't set these yet, so that tells you just how tight it is. If I try to move the rollers here, they don't move, and that's what you want. So when that happens, you set the injector height on 2, and then you set the valves on 6. And so the manual has a diagram that you follow. This is different from how you do it with a DDEC 5 and 6, where with that, and part of the reason why I've got my dial indicator there is because I started off with that procedure before I took a look and realized that I was doing it wrong. And with the 5 and 6, you are looking for max height on the injector, and essentially what you're looking for on the 1 through 4 is min height, fully up. And what you then need to measure the height is you need this indicator tool, or height measuring tool, which I will put a link to. I bought this one off of Amazon, and because it was made out of genuine Chinesium from Amazon, I did double check to make sure that it has the right 82.1 millimeter setting. Got to make sure that you have the correct height for the injectors on your engine. For this one, which is a BK, it's a 82.1. But that measurement goes to this first ridge right here. It does not go all the way to the bottom. And the reason for that is that the bottom goes into a special hole on the injector, which you can't really see, but there is a diagram for it. And this I found is kind of difficult to get. I'm sure that after you've done it a few times, you kind of just know where to put the thing and it works. But I've had a little bit of trouble trying to get into the correct location on this. It's in this general vicinity. Doesn't help that I'm trying to hold the camera and do this one-handed. Okay, there we go. So now it's in the hole. You can kind of see the position that it needs to be in. And then what you're supposed to have is just kind of this light dragging. There's a little bit of dragging, but it's not quite going up. So this injector is actually set properly. So I'm not going to need to make any kind of adjustment on that. And then you set the valves on 6, which I've already done. And then you rotate to the next cylinder with overlap, which in this case is going to be cylinder 5. So 1, 5, 3, 6, 2, 4, that's the firing order on any inline 6, at least every one that I've ever seen. So let's get this out of the way. We're going to rotate the engine to cylinder 5 having the overlap. I've already set the valves on 5, and then we'll go through and we'll set the valves on 2. Okay, so we're looking at cylinder 5 here. And as I rotate the engine, we should get to where the exhaust valves, which are currently all the way open, or close to it, will start closing and the intakes will start opening. So let's watch this and see if this works. Yep. Okay. Okay. Huh. Now we are set properly. Cylinder number 5 has overlap. The exhaust valves were closing, the intake valves were opening. You could also see at the same time that the injector on cylinder 6 was going down, so we're in about the right spot to now do cylinder number 2. So from here, obviously the exhausts, those are going to need a lot of adjustment, which we know. The intakes, these, I had to guess, these do feel just a little tight. So let's start off with the intakes. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by just showing you, checking to see whether or not this is fitting. Oh, okay, so here's my 8 mil feeler gauge. You just get it under the cup here, and this actually does fit just fine on this one. Try to get the other side as well. So actually, if anything a hair loose, those will require adjustment. The exhaust side, what you do here, where you're going to adjust it, and adjusting is the same on the intake and the exhaust, basically you twist this down until you've got some drag. The goal is that you've got enough drag that the next size up feeler gauge can't fit, but this side can. And then you take your torque wrench. Conveniently, all of these have the same torque value. Cylinders 1, 2, 3 are pretty easy to do, and after a little bit of practice you'll get the feel for where you need this so that it tightens properly. Cylinder 6 was a real pain because you don't have good access from here. Okay, let's try that. Yep, perfect. So then after you make sure can get that in. That is snug enough that I can tell that the 27 will not fit. So my 26 thousandths feeler gauge is going to be right. And then same kind of thing here. Okay, little bit of play there, just enough that I can get the gauge in and out. Okay. So now we got the intake set. Make sure, once again, yep, can get the gauge. Feeler gauge can go in. It's snug, but it will go in. That's what you want. And then now I will have to do the intakes, basically the same thing, because those were just a little bit off. So now that you've seen how to do this on cylinder number 2, which is probably going to be the easiest to video, the rest are just following the same general principle. But it's going to be easier for you if you aren't starting from scratch on some of the valves like I am, because my intake or my exhaust valves are all completely unset. But even if you were replacing the intake and the exhaust rockers and even the injector rockers, you can get close enough to at least get a first lash in and then go through a second time if you need to and be just fine. I'm probably going to go through and recheck at least my exhaust lashes after I get this completed the first time, because I did start off the first 3 cylinders looking at the injectors incorrectly. If you read through the procedure and you think about how it works, it kind of balances out, because the newer style injectors, you're basically setting the lash with them full open, and then with the old style like these, you set them with the lash full closed, or the height of them full closed, so all the way up. And you're doing that on essentially opposite sides of the cylinder that you're setting the valves on. So it really actually works out just fine either way. It takes a little bit to wrap your head around, especially with the fact that they have it as kind of opposite ways depending on which engine series you have. So, all right, enough talking. Let's get this finished up. I've got the overhead completed on all 6 cylinders now. Just a couple of notes with this. Make sure that when you have your injector height gauge put into the hole that you really have it in the right spot. And chances are, if yours is like mine, the injector should be pretty close to the correct height when you put it in, if not the exact correct height. I only had one injector that had to get adjusted. Of course, it was the number 6 way in the back. But the injectors probably won't wear a whole lot, and they should be pretty close, so you should be able to tell if you have everything correct. That will help to give you an idea of whether or not you've gotten the injector measurement height tool in the hole correctly. You'll get the hang of it probably about the time you're done with this. On my valve adjustment, I have no idea where my exhaust valves were since I took everything apart to change the rockers on them. But on my intakes, about half of them were too tight, and the ones that were too tight were way too tight. And then I had about a quarter of them that were then right on, and then about a quarter of them that were a little bit loose. So definitely did need to get done, and the ones that were tight, like I said, were way tight. They were less than half of spec. I did go through and recheck the exhausts, and of those, a couple of them needed to get readjusted, but as you'd expect, they were pretty much right on. So I've replaced my valve cover gasket. These are reusable, but this one was original, and I figured I might as well replace it. The new one does stand proud a little bit better, so it probably was going to be on its way out, and it probably would have leaked if I'd reused the old one. So now I'm just going to get the new valve cover on, torque all of this down, put my slobber tube on. Something I should have done, but I didn't, was replace this little coupling here. So I'm gonna probably get a little bit more of a mess from that, but oh well. And from there, all I'm gonna have to do is put the intake piping back on and then test run it, and this job is complete. It's been a couple months now since I finished the overhead on the Series 60 in my Prevost, and I've driven the bus about 2,000 miles since then. I can say that the bus does feel like it's running a little bit better after having done the overhead adjustment, which you would expect since I did find some valves that were off. What am I noticing in particular? It's really hard to quantify very well, but I do notice that the engine sounds just a little like it's running a little bit smoother. Seems like the power pulses are just a little bit more even. This is mostly at idle. When I'm outside around around the bus, because the reality is when you're driving a Prevost, you don't get very much feedback on what the engine is doing. Between the engine being 45 feet behind me and then just also how well insulated the Prevost is, you just don't hear a whole lot of what it's doing when you're driving down the road. But like I said, at idle, when I'm outside around the bus, it does sound like it's running a little bit better. Fuel economy wise, it was kind of hard to tell based on my previous trip if it was improved or not. I had a whole lot of headwind and crosswinds, as well as some mountains that make it really difficult to tell how your fuel economy is compared to others. And this is one of the things I found in general with RVs and large buses. People will talk about what kind of fuel economy they're getting, but I found that there's a huge variation. Are you going uphill? Are you going downhill? Do you have a headwind? Do you have a tailwind? And if you drive a whole lot of miles under the same conditions, it's easy to track all of those things. But a lot of times it can be hard to make one adjustment and then see immediately what kind of an impact it might have on fuel economy. With all that said, I do still feel like the fuel economy's gone up a little bit, as well as the engine sounding better. And regardless, since I did find that there were several valves that were off on their adjustment, it was something that needed to get done. There's really no question about this. If your engine is at the point where Detroit says you need to do your valve adjustment, you really should just get it done, whether you do it yourself or whether you take it to a shop to have it done. Ultimately, valve adjustments, or a complete overhead in this case, is really not that difficult of a job to do. You really don't need special tools besides feeler gauges. I will put some links in the description to the tools that I use for this. But the main thing that I had as a challenge was getting the rocker cover off, just because of the bedroom inspection panel in my bus really not being removable. If your bus has that removable, this is a really pretty easy job to do, and it's going to be easy to get at all of the rockers. If you're paying close attention, you may have noticed that when I originally took off the intake piping, I left the little connection piece of silicone from the intake log manifold to the pipe that came out of the intercooler in place. When I'm working on things, I tend to try to take off as little as possible, and sometimes that bites me. This was one of those times. Because I had left that silicone connection hose on there, it made getting the rocker cover back on a whole lot harder, and in the process of getting it on, I managed to also end up getting the valve cover gasket knocked out of its groove in a couple of places. This resulted in a pretty bad oil leak coming out of the valve cover gasket. So when I got home from my first trip, I had to pull that whole thing apart, take the valve cover off again, buy a new gasket, put the new gasket in, and this time it went a whole lot simpler. So take that little silicone hose off, it will make things a whole lot simpler. Another tip that I can give with that is that when you are putting the new valve cover gasket in the groove, if you just coat it with some oil, put a little bit of oil on your fingers or on your gloves, and then just kind of run it around the seal, that will make it go into the groove and stay there a whole lot easier. That definitely made things much simpler the second time around versus the first time. Like with a lot of things, but after you do it the first time, you learn everything you do wrong, and after that it goes simply. But like I said, overall, this is not a difficult job to do. Honestly, the hardest part of the whole thing is getting to the number 8 valve cover bolt that holds it down, and that one is on the driver's side furthest forward, which is very difficult to get to without that bedroom panel removable. But I was still able to do it, so it's still a doable job, and the second time around I got the whole thing completed, a valve cover off, new gasket on, everything back together in about an hour. So in summary, if you've hit the mileage mark, it's time to get your overhead done per Detroit. Just get it done whether you do it or you take it somewhere else. Leave any questions down below in the comments, and as always, thanks for watching.